Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar with our speakers, Dr. Seema Jacob and Dr. Dara Zafran. This discussion hour is hosted by the American Psychological Association's Division of International Psychology, Division 52. It is a part of an ongoing series to celebrate the activities of psychologists around the world and to provide useful information for international engagement and to encourage all of us to take a broad and global perspective. This webinar is the first one that focuses on graduate students and early career psychologists from international perspectives. Special thanks to the board members of Division 52, especially Dr. Mary Bullock, the Division 52 Webinar Committee, Dr. Satoko Kamara, and the Division for 52's Early Career Psychologist Committee for making today's event come together. My name is Dr. LeAnn DeHoff. I'm the current chair of the ECP Committee for Division 52. I will be hosting this webinar, and I'll start with a few organizational notes. Today's session will begin with a presentation by Drs. Jacob and Zafran. During the presentation, all of you who are participating online as observers will have the ability to ask questions by typing them in the chat box located at the bottom of your screen. If you're unable to see the chat box, hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen and the chat box icon should appear. Please feel free to type in your questions during the presentation. I will make a note of them, and during the last 10 to 12 minutes, I will present them to Drs. Jacob and Zafran for discussion. Lastly, this event will be recorded and then posted on the Division 52 website, www.div52.org. Because we have less than an hour, let me continue with a brief introduction of our presenters. Dr. Seema Jacob is an early career psychologist and assistant professor. Her interests involve supervision and training of international students in clinical education of global mental health. Her specialties involve diagnosis and early screening of autism spectrum disorder and other developmental disabilities, assessment and relationship-based intervention with high-risk birth to 5-year-old children and their families, medically fragile infants, provision of family-centered care, and interdisciplinary work. Her long-term professional interests include community-based research, systemic program development, and research-informed public policy. Dr. Dara Zafran is an early career clinical psychologist and assistant professor. Her research is in student development and international experiential service learning. Dr. Zafran is a member of Division 52 International Psychology and a member of the Early Career Psychologist Committee, serving as the chair of the Marketing Subcommittee. She has traveled the world learning about systemic treatment models and culturally sensitive approaches for children, families, and communities. It is a great pleasure to be able to turn over the microphone to you, Drs. Jacob and Zafran. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your work with us.
A pleasure to be here. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. Good afternoon or early evening, depending on what time zone you're coming in from. We're excited to present to you today. We just wanted to disclose that we have no financial relationships. Next slide. And just a brief disclaimer that the immigration policies and statuses frequently change. And so this presentation is not comprehensive of all the current legal requirements for international students. And so it's strongly recommended that all participants of this webinar consult with relevant legal experts or your university's international student advisor. Next slide. So LeAnn just gave us some thank yous, and we also wanted to thank the personal people in our lives who have been part of our journeys, our parents and family, friends, mentors along the way, and of course our supervisors. Next slide. Okay. So we have some learning objectives that we will be covering today. We're really going to try to focus on the unique needs of international students and also potential challenges that are faced by learners in the U.S. studying psychology. And then we hope that you can apply the knowledge that you learned today to support your educational journey moving forward. Okay, so a little background about the statistics around international students. The US is comprised of many learners from different countries, the top two being from China and India. And actually those two countries make up 50% of the total enrollment of international students in the US. So over the years, there's been a large increase in the international students who choose to study in the US, but there's also been a decrease in the graduate level students who have come to the US. And so we're going to address a little bit of that. The interesting thing is that there's some research about the top places that students come and study in the US. Number one being New York City. Number two being studying in Los Angeles. The third top place is Boston, and then Chicago and Dallas after that. Next slide. Okay, so I would like our participants to kind of take a moment to reflect back on your reasons for deciding to come to the US for your own studies. Thinking about your thoughts, your expectations before you arrived. Were there things that you worried about? Were there hopes that you wanted to come true? Were your reasons part of the pursuit of a professional knowledge that maybe wasn't available in your home country? Were there reasons that were related to your family that made the decision happen? Or were there different educational opportunities here in the US that you were striving for? And even if you're a participant right now who hasn't been an international student in the US, just take a moment to think about a time where you may have traveled abroad or lived abroad, and some of those thoughts and experiences as well. The reason I bring up the reflection is because in my own personal research, we've revealed that the reflection process is extremely crucial in really supporting and contributing to the learning experience. And specifically, my research has found that, that participation in group discussions and taking pictures and doing regular journal entries are some of the most powerful ways that students have found to reflect on their experience. So next slide. So as a doctoral student, you're not only mastering the academic skills of critiquing, articulating, researching, and writing about your field that are complex, but it also touches all the personal parts of your life. And so as an international student in the US, and other graduate students too, you're not only developing your research identity, but you're also trying to collaborate and integrate that with your existing personal and professional identities. And again, with the research that I've done in experiential service learning, we have found that significant changes in your personal and professional development can occur if you are doing the reflection before the experience, throughout the experience, and then once the experience has completed. And so that at all the different checkpoints is really how we see the most significant changes in your personal and professional identity. So because there is such a decrease in the graduate students going into studying within the US, we really want to make sure that some of these challenges and special considerations are important for the universities to consider, for the students yourself to know about, and for supervisors who are working with international scholars. And so you'll hear a little bit more, but with Dr. Jacob discussing her own personal journey from graduate school on. Next slide. Okay. So according to the Arison and Bollinger, international students really have unique needs. And so traditional programming where you're attending a school, and scholars who have also just attended on an online program have been studied through these researchers. And they saw a high level of isolation, both academically and socially. And so some of the things that they found in their research was that that there was a large challenge with mastering a new language. And so these language difficulties really leading to some confusions or misunderstanding, struggle with course and program content, and then contributing to anxiety and stress. If there's language differences, there may be some stress around participating and speaking up in class or doing presentations if they're not feeling as fluid with the English language. Some of the things that they also found is that there's a large adjustment for international students to adjust to the academic culture in the United States. So the people they studied really talked about having differences between the academic cultures of their home country and the US, different ways of thinking and different ways of seeing the world that these researchers referred to as learning shock. So we hear a lot about culture shock, but they touched on the topic also of learning shock. Next slide. So as we just described, there's language barriers that can be related to psychological well-being as well as academic performance. There's also feelings of isolation and alienation, and then feelings of culture shock, and then issues concerning adjustment and adaptation, or also alienation. So international students are also describing being perceived as ethnic minorities, coming from a country where they were not a minority into the US where their status is different. So next slide. Okay, so next we're going to talk about another researcher, Tumala Nara and Claudius, who really focused on studying Muslim international students in the US. And some of their findings were really fascinating. The participants of this study really talked about how a theme of hope and appreciation for educational opportunities in the US that they may not have had in their country of origin. They also discussed some challenges, such as a need for social support, that this was so critical to navigate them separating from their family and friends, difficulties, with not having a religious community, and difficulties of kind of balancing their spiritual practices with their academic demands. Some of the other things that were reported that need to be considered are discrimination and the distress that has come from that. People looking at them differently, or different experiences that they've had in their training and in their graduate program. Also, really this reformation of their religious identity. And so challenging finding that balance between the academic demands and making time for the spiritual side and the spiritual time that they may have been accustomed to. Also difficulties with the religious identity in terms of lack of transportation to mosques, or things being further away from their home or their school, then that is making a difference in how often that they can engage in spiritual practice. And on the flip side, also continuing their spiritual beliefs in the US was also reported as a source of strength. And so strengthening their religious identity as well was reported. So, and then they really, we talked about on the last slide about English being a challenge if you're not proficient, but also that these participants described that they improved their English over their doctoral training and throughout their training after that. And then one of the things that was interesting too is it made a difference about the stress depending if the participant came alone to the US or if they brought their family as well. And with that, there were also two sides of the coin where, you know, some of them experienced that social support, bringing their family with them. But then some of them also reported that it was difficult and distressing for them to also kind of see that their spouse or their family were also going through the acculturation process. So next slide. So I'm assuming that many of the participants online right now are in a doctoral program already, but we will talk about later resources of things to consider if you are maybe in a master's program and thinking about applying for a doctoral program. But we're now going to focus really on once you're done with your doctoral training, then the requirement of internship and things to consider. And so for any graduate student, internship process is stressful enough. There are, you know, letters of rec, everything that you can imagine that you need to put together for the application. But there's really some more unique needs and some more added stress if you are an international student in this process. So we're hoping that, you know, with some advanced knowledge and some of these resources, having the preparation and things to consider may ease the burden and reduce a little bit of the stress. And we'll discuss some of those resources as well. So things to consider, this is just not a comprehensive list, but to think of the legal restrictions. And we'll talk more about that on the next slide. Also what the learner's current visa status is, if there are plans to stay in the country and be involved in postdoctoral training in the US. Also to consider the site's openness for cross-cultural training. And then one thing to consider are, you know, on internship, many contracts may be state and federally funded or a state and federal agency. And some of those contracts will require that the trainees have US citizenship. So it will be important to know about all the different rotations that you might have exposure to and what those citizenship requirements are. And so although you may not be thinking all the way past internship, it's also important to think about, are you going to plan on being licensed in the US? And we'll point you to some resources because certain states have certain requirements that you may want to, you know, jump ahead a few years and think about. Or was your plan just to get your training and education in the US and then practice in your home community? Next slide. So these are not a comprehensive list, but some steps of finding a good fit on internship. And so there, if you're not already familiar with the APEC website, they list for all the different programs if US citizenship is required to apply to their program. We also suggest that you contact current and previous international trainees who have been at that actual site, who can talk to you candidly about their experience in that specific town, in that specific program, working with that specific population, so that you can really get an unbiased opinion. And then, you know, some ways to look at if multicultural issues are addressed is to look at the programs you're looking at and to see if they talk about diversity and identity in their mission statements. And if there is a variety of training opportunities that seem to include and incorporate multicultural aspects. Also, asking in your interview what clientele you will be serving. Is it a heterogeneous or a you know, are they all the same type of clients? And so that may inform your decision of which site would be the best fit for you. Also asking if you are planning on continuing for postdoctoral training or once you're licensed, if that program can support the legal process or the visa process for training and employment. And all of these things, you know, you can ask during your interview, having a conversation with the training director, speaking to current interns, and then also if your training site is attached to a university, to check with the Office of International Affairs at the places that you're considering, because they have tons of great information. Next slide. Some things also to consider with the transition process is the research and the literature has said that the learner has had this acculturation and culture shock process, and then to think about if you want to do a reacculturation just for a one-year internship, or if it would be more comfortable for you to kind of have a site where you see yourself long-term. And so some people may choose to only apply in their state because it was such an adjustment just to be where they had just moved, and then to think of moving again and learning all about a new community may be too stressful at that time. So thinking about if you're up for relocation and reacculturation. Of course, you know, there's going to be more information about different visa statuses, but you want to know from the site how they how your training is considered. Do they consider it an optional practicum training? Do they consider it employment? Because that can affect your visa status or needing to return home and come back, depending on how they are classifying that. So it's going to be really important to advise your training director of your legal status, and also to inform your home institute so that they can implement the proper stuff into the SEBI's database. But you also on your own want to double check that that's been done. And inform others of your needs, that, you know, it's important for you to connect with this type of community when you come, so that your program that you're matching with can help with that process. Next slide. So it's not only the journey of the learner, but also a huge responsibility of the supervisor to support this process. And so these are some things that to keep in mind. Lee, in 2008, he said that we know that a supervisor can make or break a PhD student. And so to really think about a cross-cultural relationship. And so some of the researchers like Erickson and Broller, their studies expressed that a lot of the international learners felt like the academic experience was a one-way communication, that the student was needing to learn about the dominant US culture and to learn about where they were, but that they didn't feel like the supervisor took an interest in where their background and beliefs and values and how that integrated into their work. So it's something to consider as a supervisor, having that reciprocal cross-cultural communication. Also, to address issues of isolation, to help the supervisee connect with different communities or know of mental health resources or services in the area that the student has just moved to. Some other tips in the literature was that and so maybe you have an orientation for your program, but to let the international learner know about the orientation that may be hosted by your university's international office, and to make sure that they have time in their schedule to go to both yours and the other orientation. Because language, and you don't know for sure the English proficiency of some of the learners, to put a lot of the information in written form and maybe in different languages, and also to have some resources of collaborating with the local communities for the various needs of somebody coming to the US for the first time. So next slide. So also considerations that Dr. Jacob will kind of talk about as well is to look at your eligibility, being very clear with your current visa status. As we talked about before, knowing specific state laws. A lot of VAs and hospital federal sites have different requirements for licensure or participation on grant-funded projects. And then really have a clear understanding of the funding, the salary, and the benefits that's available to you. Next slide. And so these are some of the resources that we wanted to have you take away with before Dr. Jacob gives her story. And so we talked about having the most current information on internship site requirements. Also, there's a lot of beautiful graduate resources through APACS. And then there's a lot of nice through International Student about tips for planning your trip to the US once you've arrived, test prep, thinking about long-term budgeting and financial aid. Next slide. And we put a whole host of resources to think about and work with to get all the current and up-to-date visa requirements. And so these first few websites, your Office of International Affairs, to consider having individual legal counsel, and also having your university center as well. So next slide.
Thank you, Dr. Zafran, for an amazing overview of what you found in literature and sort of your own research work and experiential learning. A very good afternoon to all of you. This is Seema Jacob, and I am really very grateful for this opportunity to present a slice of my journey with a lot of you at Division 52, but also an amazing platform to highlight some of the unique needs of people that travel from across the world to a new place, to a new country, and trying to learn how to live in addition to how to learn and become better selves professionally and personally. A little bit about myself, but before I start that, I do want to say that, you know, this is a very personal experience. So in that sense, it's personally biased and it's just my perspective. I'm sure there are themes and similar experiences that a lot of international students that come into this country for learning, but I won't say it's the same for everyone, but I do want to highlight that. So this is my personal journey, and it's in that sense, very biased. So that being said, a little bit about myself. You know, I born as a female into a Christian, middle-class, South Asian, Indian family. You know, we are, as a country, we have a lot of languages. Growing up, I was exposed to 3 languages. My native language, which is Malayalam, my national language, which is Hindi, and then you know, the global language, which is English. And then by the time I entered elementary school, I also started being exposed to the local language, which was Marathi. So that being said, you know, my parents are also very well educated, and they both worked. They were full-time working parents, raising 3 children, trying to balance sort of their own professional roles and their own personal and sort of communal goals. Being raised in India, I think one of the pieces that has been very much, you know, imbibed in me or ingrained in me is like strict gender roles. You know, as a woman, you get to do a lot of things, and you don't get to do a lot of things. So there was very sort of strict sort of gender roles and biases, and you could not really break the box. As a family, my family valued a lot of importance in like success in your academics. So you had to excel in your education and you pursue education. That was really valued. Another big piece of growing up was respect for all living beings. respect for authority, respect for the elders, and just respect of differences, because you grow up in a community with people speaking different languages, having different spiritual beliefs, having different values. So you need to respect. And there was a lot of pride around that. Honor and pride was another value that I was that I was raised with, and that's something that I really till today take a lot of pride in that. The other big piece of growing up was relationships. And when I think about relationships, it's not just relationships with my parents or my siblings or my close friends, but it's also to all of my extended family members. You know, they were important people in my life who had influence in what I do, what choices I make, who has influence in where I go. So they had a lot of say. They, extended family members had a huge say in how I was raised and how I'm disciplined. But also relationships with your own community. And community could be your religious community within your church, within your temple. It could be the specific area that you're living in, your neighbors. So there was a lot of emphasis on these relationships that you had in your life. Another big thing that my family emphasized was giving back to the community. You have to give back to the place that you're living in, give back to the people in need, give back to the people that are underserved. So I spent my first 24 years of my life in India. I finished my bachelor's and my master's, my terminal master's in psychology in India. And sometime around that, after I finished my master's, I started working. I started working as a school counselor. Next slide, please. And what I realized was I was not happy with the kind of work that I could do. I wanted more clinical experiences, range of experiences. And I needed a space where I could think a little more about my work and sort of excel in what I do. Once again, tying it back to my own value of how can I be successful in the academics, how can I be successful in what I'm doing? And I truly need to give back to the community in the best way possible. So at that point of time, I did a lot of research and I realized US is a place where there's a lot of research that's coming out of psychology. So I need to go to the US to get an educational degree. Being 24 years old, being a young adult, my parents' priorities were different. A lot of my people that I knew, extended family members, neighbors, they all their priorities were different, because you have a young woman, she's educated, she's finished her master's, she needs to go ahead and settle down and have a family. So some of the comments that I got when I said, I want to go to the US to study is, you're crazy, you're stubborn. Why are you doing this? Few more years and you'll settle down and you'll have beautiful children and just take care of them. I think being a female too was another piece that here I am, who's very ambitious, and I want to go to a different country that my parents did not foresee going to. They did not foresee coming with me. But I also didn't have any sort of guidance of what I'm doing and how I'm doing and how do I go about achieving it. I knew I wanted to go to the US to study, so I said, I will give it a try to the best of my ability. And I said, I'll walk this path, even if it's dark and it seems like there is no light, I will find my way through the dark. And that's what I did. In my journey of sort of trying to look for schools, I came across a group of other individuals who wanted to pursue a degree in the US, and I sort of befriended them. And from there started a little bit of like social support around, what paperwork to do, what tests to write, and, where they're going, how are they determining what to look at schools. So we sort of had these group sort of phenomena happening where we read something from Wikipedia or from the internet or from Google, and we sort of shared that with each other and sort of supported each other in sort of writing the initial tests. I think as I started doing this process, what I also realized is, in the US, there's so much beautiful work being done. There's so diverse work being done in the field of psychology, and that's definitely where I want to be. It became my land of my dreams, where I can be a successful psychologist. I can be a creative psychologist. And definitely I wanted to go to New York because I wanted to go see the ball drop, because I get to see that on BBC World News every year at midnight. So I wanted to go to New York. That being said, I passed all the exams, I applied, and I got interviews to several different programs. And then comes the next phase, which is the phone interviews. And I have never done phone interviews in my life, and I did not know what to expect. So I gave it a shot. The phone interviews were fine. What was interesting was I didn't understand half the time what they asked me, and I had to keep asking them to repeat themselves because they had a weird accent, and I think they probably felt the same about me. I never got to ask them that. But despite even at this stage, I felt like I was still walking in the dark, not really knowing where I'm heading and what this means in a bigger picture. I knew I wanted to go to the US. I knew I wanted to become a psychologist. I knew I wanted to learn, and this was the path. I don't know where I would end up, but, and if this is meant to be, I will go ahead. Next slide. So, I got admissions. I accepted offer in one of the schools. And then I decided, let's pursue the next step, which is the visa step, which I have no idea. My parents have never studied abroad. My siblings have never studied abroad, so none of them know what it means to apply for a visa. Once again, walking in the dark. I went ahead with the paperwork, read stuff on the US consulate in India, set up appointments. It was a little bit of a financial stress because it required you to have some sort of money, and so I had to borrow it from my family. But even during the interview and after the interview and after I got the visa process, there was no really guidance or sort of a space to hold what this means to travel to a new country. All I knew to my big, bright, shiny dreams is I wanted to go to the US without really realizing what it is. And all I knew is, yes, I'm going to live in a city like New York. And that's what the experience will be. And I look forward to it. So, once I got my visa, in about 2 weeks, I had my flight and I was in the US. But the 2 weeks was pretty stressful because I did not know where to start. I knew I was coming to the country for the next 5 to 6 years, but I didn't know what to pack. And my parents didn't know either. So, I packed maybe about 6 pairs of good clothes, 2 pairs of shoes. My mom made sure she gave me all the essential Indian groceries because, being a student, I'm a poor student. I don't have a lot of money. I don't even have a job in the US. So she wanted to make sure I had all my lentils, my rice, all my spices. She also made very special pickles for me so that, I get a little bit of home, which I was very excited about. But I packed my entire world in 2 bags. And I was very excited, but also very anxious. Because the day came when I was at the airport and all I know is I had to say goodbye to my family. And I didn't have enough time to prep for it. And I didn't know, what holds for me in the new place, in the new country. And this was also the first time that I ever rode a plane all by myself. And so that was pretty scary. All my friends, my relatives, they started giving me advice right before I got onto the plane, be careful, keep your bags to yourself. You don't want to get into any kind of drug business. People can sometimes steal your bag and put drugs in your bag. Oh, that did not really help me because I was very anxious throughout my plane rides. And I remember I watched my bag like a hawk, even when it was in the overhead bin the entire time. And then I was so exhausted from all of my plane ride, and I came to this country, and my stop was in Detroit. My parents have always been very over-prepared. They prepare to the max. That's how they've always lived their life. They've planned their life. They've saved for their life. They've always prepped for their life. And so I had all of my, passport copies and F1 student visa copies, all of my paperwork for my F1s, the address that I'm going to live at, my university address. And, I gave this officer all of this paper, and he asked me questions like, so you're here as a student? And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, yeah, like that's why I gave you the paperwork. But not realizing that these were questions they were asking me so that I can pass through the checkpoints, and they wanted to make sure the person that is being reflected on the paperwork is me. But I remember feeling like these are very stupid questions. Why would they even ask me? And I was kind of annoyed because they were very simple questions and I gave them the paperwork. So wouldn't it make sense that they knew all the answers? Anyway, the transition process into the country went easy. And then I came to my state, or the city that I was going to be in, which was a very interesting experience, primarily because I landed in this country and realized I am in no place like New York. I am not in New York. I'm somewhere in the Midwest. Someone from the international office came and picked me up for a ride to my friend's home. That's where I was going to stay. And I remember asking this person who came to pick me up, I believe he was from Sri Lanka. I said, so how long would it take for us to get to the city? And he looks at me weird and he says, this is the city, Seema. Like, you are in the city. And I'm like, what? Like, there is like open space and lands. Where are all the high rises? Where are the busy cars? Where are all the people? And he's like, well, this is city. This is a different kind of city in the US. So welcome to, the Midwest. That was one of the first shocks I ever received after landing into the Midwest. Within 2 days, I went into my university where I realized my first few months of my grad school was actually an eye-opener to a lot of my experiences. It was an eye-opener to a lot of my worldviews. It shattered a lot of my expectations and my perceptions of what New York would be. It brought me to a lot of tears because I really missed home, because it put me in spaces that were very uncomfortable. And I think primarily it was the culture shock. And I think it's also because of what Dr. Zafran was explaining before, the learner shock. It was a new academic environment. It was a new country. It was new people. It was a new way of relating that I did not know how to be and how to survive. Finance was always a stress. It continued to be a stress throughout my life as a student. I didn't have an SSI, and therefore I didn't have a job. And because I didn't have a job or a credit history, I couldn't rent an apartment. So I was, I had to find people who could rent the apartment and I could share the rent with them. I couldn't work off campus, so I had to find, a job on campus. I had transportation difficulties because we had classes in 2 different campuses, and I did not really realize that when I accepted the program, and I don't think that was ever sort of communicated to me. And even if it was, I don't remember it didn't even phase through me. So trying to figure out how to do this in the best way possible was quite a struggle. And I don't think I would have been able to survive this without a group of other international students who've either walked this journey ahead of me or who has started the journey with me. And so we formed this beautiful group of just students from different countries that were in the same space, in the same program. And we sort of supported and we tried to figure this out for ourselves and looked out for ourselves. And one of the things we learned too in this journey was we needed to let our program know, this is not working for us. These are our needs. And it helped. It helped. I think one of the most striking experience for me was my multicultural and diversity classroom, because I think coming into a diversity classroom where they're talking about race and ethnicity, and for me, someone who comes from a country where gender is the biggest issue, being a female is one of my biggest identities and something that I've been marginalized for my entire life. Understanding Black and white, I did not get it. I do not know American history. I don't know about racism. And I did not identify myself from an ethnicity point of view. So I always thought to myself, I'm not Black, I'm not white, and I'm not even brown. I am another. I am international. But even if an international, I'm not international. I am Indian. I don't think there was a space to sort of think about that and discuss about that. There were lots of good things about being in this country. My first snow experience was one of the best, and I think till today, it's something that I always remember with fond memories. But just for the first few days, because after that I was sick and tired of the cold, and then I wanted it to be warm, and then I missed home a lot. Writing difficulties and language problems. And I want to say, even though I have been educated in English for my whole life, language was still a barrier, because the way we use language, even English language within the US, is very different. And I want to say how interpersonally people communicate to each other here in the US is very different than how I have been raised to. So that was definitely a challenge, and it led to a lot of miscommunications and misunderstandings. Writing, raised in a country where I had to write about 30 pages for my exams, to now writing in a very active voice and very succinct and very summarized and in maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs was quite a challenge. Definitely writing within the American standards was also hard, and it had to be sort of learned. And I could do that with support from my other students, from my other colleagues, from this community of people that I was part of. Next. So that being said, my graduate school years also led to, the big internship year, because now you have to apply for internship, and it was stressful. It was financially stressful. It was also stressful because, once again, you feel like you're walking in the dark, not really knowing what this means, where do you want to go. I knew when I wanted to work with kids, there were a lot of programs that I could not apply to because of my status. And luckily I found a couple of programs. I also successfully completed an internship program within a field that I wanted to specialize in, within the early childhood. And I want to highlight some of the good pieces about that experience was experiencing a different part of the US. Yes, I had to learn this new country. I had to learn this new way of being, a new language, a new accent. I had to learn more about that population, but I also ended up with a supervisor and a training director who was very, in a true sense, cross-cultural. They were interested in me. They wanted to know what I wanted to do. They wanted to know what my perspective was. It sort of shaped a lot of sort of my own personal needs and my own professional sort of development of who I was as a professional. And in that process, I also realized that our systems do not know a lot about international students. And it sort of fell on me to educate them, to educate the system, but to also educate my program about what I needed to be successful in their program. Next. From my internship year, we also, I moved into my fellowship year. I wanted to pursue an education based on sort of I had a mentor in my internship program where in our discussions together, I realized I needed more training in the world of early childhood. And so I applied to a few different programs. But I also realized, in working with my mentor, that this communication is important, communication about who I am. And when I say who I am, not necessarily my own personal identity or my personal needs, but more about my immigration needs. That was absolutely necessary. And I had to bring it to the table, when I met with the training director of all these fellowship programs. Some of them made efforts to learn, some of them said they didn't know and that I would have to talk to their international office. But it also gave me sort of an insight into, how do these systems respond to things that they don't know? Because my journey as an international student and my immigration status and these legal requirements is going to be stressful. It's going to be a lot of unknown to systems that I come across. And how would they respond to is going to be very important to me. I ended up in a fellowship where this training director, a wonderful person who really took the time to support me with that. I also realized that I needed to take I needed to go get legal advice because people didn't know. I didn't know. I'm reading a lot off the website, and sometimes they're very heavy legal language, which I did not understand or maybe even sometimes misunderstood, and I needed legal advice. So either seeking out like immigration attorneys who I could consult with for an hour or for half an hour and sort of helping me know what my routes are, what my choices are, was important. I think throughout this whole process, and I'm cutting this short because I'm realizing we're sort of close with time. Next slide. Throughout this whole process, I think what I do want to sort of reflect back on is social support is one huge thing. And a lot of us do not have social support when we come to this country. So creating a network of friends, and it doesn't have to be, 20, 25 friends. It could just be 4 friends, and then talking to people about your needs, educating systems about your needs is something that's very important. Seeking out, either mentors or even faculty members, like who would be open to, building an alliance with them, bringing in some advocate on your team, bringing in some person who can really who's willing to listen to you is something that is important. Like for me, just the fact that I was heard and just the fact that someone knew all of the issues and struggles I had felt very validating and freeing, that I'm not alone in this journey. And in that sense, I'm not completely isolated. Was something that really helped me psychologically as I went through these different phases of my life. I also think at some point of time when you do decide to switch, either your visa status, it's important for you to go seek out legal advice, because there's so much of changes happening at every turn that you have to keep yourself updated. And sometimes systems won't know that, or websites might not reflect that. So it's good to go seek out legal consults to determine what is the best journey for you, what's the best route for you, and given what country you're migrating from or what status you're on. Next. That being said, I think my next goals is to sort of do this. This is my sort of personal agenda, my own personal desire, that this is something that I'm hoping, I can give back to my international community of students and young professionals. And, this is a very good first platform for me to start doing that, to bring about some awareness. Another big part of my sort of personal journey is, how do I bring about some of these cross-cultural issues within my own supervision, but also with my own supervisee? And I think that's sort of like my own personal agenda and that I want to like incorporate in my own personal journey. And the last but not least, my own identity as a psychologist, as Seema, what this means. Because right now I find myself traveling between 2 worlds. And I think that's a luxury that not a lot of people can afford, because I know both these worlds. I've lived in both these worlds, and I can travel between both these worlds, and I can pick and choose what I want about these worlds and incorporate that within my own identity about who I am. And I think that should summarize sort of my portion. And I know we wanted to sort of bring back the resource slides back. So next slide, just for the participants.
Yeah, for you guys to look at while we're answering any questions.
Great. Thank you, Doctors Jacob and Zafran. This is LeAnn DeHoff again. I'm looking at the questions, and I'm seeing a question here from a participant in regards to kind of the opposite situation, that if they are a student in the U.S. and they want to go to a study abroad program or do their dissertation in another country. And I know we also got an email earlier today regarding that. So that might be another presentation of interest. I'm wondering if there is maybe a go-to resource or maybe some recommendations that you have for somebody in this situation.
Yeah, that's a great question. I did my dissertation with research abroad, and that has been my focus of research. So I don't know if there's a way that I could share my email address with that participant, and we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I can actually, is it the one that you and I use? I can send that to her.
Yes, that would
Okay, great. I will do that. Good. And I think we have time for just one more question. We're at 3:55 Eastern time. And I'm going to ask Dr. Jacob, from your journey as international status, what kinds of support services have been the most useful for you in the U.S.? And were there any additional, I think it's more important, were there any additional support services that you just wish you had or that wish that existed?
Thank you for the question. I think like when I'm thinking about how systems can support me, and correct me if I'm wrong, LeAnn, like you're talking about systemic supports, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, yeah. I think from a systemic point of view, I wish it was a little more organized and thought about. So it's not just handing packets to international students, but maybe a forum for them to get together to talk about some of these acculturation issues, or these the learning shock that Dr. Zafran was talking about, like a space to sort of talk about those. I think there needs to be more sort of thoughtful communication about what it means to be an international student here under the status, and what are some things you need to have, be it SSI, be it housing, be it having a car. Like, how do you go about navigating this in a new country? And I'm not sure if this is true for every university that has international students, but in my own personal journey, I felt like the system was not organized around that, and they had students together, sometimes they had socials together, but not an organized space to talk or reflect about some of these experiences. I also think mentorship and guidance is something that systems can think about for international students, because they have different issues, and navigating two different worlds, navigating what they know and they feel confident about, and navigating this new world is hard. And we all can benefit from mentors and supervisors, not just for our clinical work, but for our own sort of professional journey and our development. I had the privilege of having mentors when I was in my internship program, and I really loved that. And I think my process during internship and then transition to postdoc was so smooth because I had that mentor. So those are some two big pieces that I think about when I think about systemic changes or systemic supports.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Jacob.
Thank you.
What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much to both of you for taking your time and sharing this information with us today. This concludes our webinar. It is our first webinar using the Zoom technology. Thank you again to Dr. Mary Bolak, President of Division 52, for managing the Zoom webinar tool. And thank you to all of our audience members for participating in this webinar. We hope you found value in today's event. Your feedback is really important to us. After this webinar, a survey will be sent to you. Please provide your feedback about the content and format of today's discussion. And if you registered for the APA-approved CE, which was a separate $15 fee, your certificate will automatically be emailed to you once you complete the survey. Thank you to Dr. Lynette Bykos and Seattle Pacific University for making the CE credits possible. Lastly, thank you again to Drs. Jacob and Zafran for your time and your contribution and giving us a fascinating presentation. I'm sure we all have a lot to think about. Thank you, everyone.